All right, so we left off here with this electron transport chain. Again, happening in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And this is where we're taking all of those NADH and FADH2 from both glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, and we're bringing those hydrogen ions and those electrons here to the electron transport chain. So just like the electron transport chain we saw in photosynthesis, we're taking these electrons, and as they move down these energy levels, they're releasing energy to pump these hydrogen ions from the outer membrane to the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So we create this concentration gradient of a lot of hydrogen ions inside, very few outside, so that when we open up this ATP synthase, they all rush out. Just like with a dam, generating electricity, here as these hydrogen ions flow through this enzyme, we're producing ATP, that energy molecule. So this is where the bulk of our ATP is coming from, is this electron transport chain process. And this is just another image showing this process where we have these pumps. As the electrons move down, we're pumping hydrogen in. And then it runs through the ATP synthase, producing ATP. Okay? And this is just showing this process in the form of a GIF or GIF. Okay? So we have our NADH taking these hydrogen ions with that energy from the electrons, pumping them to the inner membrane, okay? And we keep doing this process, okay, where we keep pumping these hydrogen ions across, so that when we're ready, we pump them through the other way and get the energy. And if you watch that electron there, you saw that it was picked up by some hydrogen ions and formed water. This is where we're forming the rest of our water in this cellular respiration process. Here we form the ATP from those hydrogen ions pumping through that ATP synthase. So again, with the electron transport chain, for each NADH, we're getting 3 to 4, we're pumping 10 hydrogens. 3 to 4 hydrogens gives us 1 ATP. FADH2 pumps 6 to 7. So for each glucose, we're getting something like 32 to 34 ATP from the electron transport chain itself. Okay, so in glycolysis, 2 ATP per glucose molecule netted, right? We used 2 but gained 4, so overall we got 2. The Krebs cycle, we're getting 2 ATP out of this process per glucose molecule. The electron transport chain somewhere between 32 and 34. So we're getting 36 to 38 ATP from start to finish glycolysis through cellular respiration from each glucose molecule. Okay. This just shows that process again. 2 ATP out of glycolysis, 2 from Krebs cycle, 33 approximately from the electron transport chain, for a total of 36 to 38, about 37. Okay. This just shows that image again in the cytoplasm, glycolysis. We're taking those pyruvate, turning into acetyl-CoA, goes into the Krebs cycle, getting that ATP. This is where we're producing all our carbon dioxide, right? You breathe in oxygen, release carbon dioxide. Those CO2s are being stripped off of those glucose molecules. Then we go through the electron transport chain. That oxygen that we're breathing in is picking up all of those loose electrons from this electron transport chain, and that's forming water. We're taking those hydrogen ions, and we're taking the oxygen that comes in along with those electrons, and we're forming water, which is why when we exhale, there's some water vapor that comes out with it. And this is that exact same image, just breaks it down, again, overlaying actual image of a mitochondria. Okay, so when we look at this, right, we breathe in 21% oxygen, 0.03% CO2, 78% nitrogen, and a very small amount of water vapor. When we exhale, that oxygen's down to 16%. And it goes down because we use that oxygen. Carbon dioxide's up to 3% because we're producing that CO2 by breaking down the glucose. Nitrogen stays the same because we don't use it. And our breath is significantly moist. There's a lot more water vapor in it because we're using this oxygen, bonding it with those electrons and the hydrogen ions, and producing water. So there's a lot more water when we exhale than when we inhaled. So again, reason that we need oxygen is to pick up those food electrons, right? All of those electrons that are produced in this process have the ability to damage your mitochondria, to damage your cells. If you've ever seen foods that have labels of antioxidant or says that it picks up free radicals, this is what it's doing, is it helps to pick up these food electrons and stop them from doing damage within your cells. Okay? So if you're not convinced that you need oxygen, go ahead, try the scientific method, stop breathing. Okay? Eventually you'd pass out and your body would start breathing again. Okay? Mitochondria and aging. Okay? You do have DNA within your mitochondria, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the semester as to why. But it takes a lot more damage than DNA within our nucleus because it's not as well protected. We have these electrons here from this electron transport chain that can damage the membranes of the mitochondria and damage that DNA. So these membranes become more leaky with age, and as they get older, they produce more free radicals. You got this very vicious cycle, which are why antioxidants are something that we like to consume, because it protects these mitochondria over a longer span of time. Now we've got these two main pathways here. We've got our aerobic pathway, which was this cellular respiration. Most eukaryotic cells are going to do this. Then we've got our anaerobic pathways, these pathways that happen without oxygen. Prokaryotes, some protists will do this. Aerobic respiration and fermentation both start with glycolysis, taking glucose, turning it into 2-pyruvate. This is where things become different. With fermentation, we get 2 more ATP per glucose molecule. So with glycolysis and fermentation, you're only getting 4 ATP per glucose. But again, with aerobic respiration, we're getting something like 38. So it's significantly more efficient to do the aerobic respiration than the anaerobic fermentation. There are two types of fermentation that we see. We've got alcoholic fermentation, where that pyruvate is turned into ethanol and carbon dioxide. This is what yeasts do, and that's what's in this image up here. So when you bake bread and that bread rises, it's because they're producing that CO2. All of the alcohol gets cooked off within the bread, which is why you don't taste it in there. But this is that fermentation process. They're taking that sugar, which is why you put sugar in bread with that yeast, so they can break down that sugar, produce the CO2 to make it rise. Then we've got lactate fermentation, which our cells as humans will do if there's low oxygen. Okay, we're going to take that pyruvate, we're going to pick up hydrogen, NADH, and we're going to form lactate. So here we see our alcohol fermentation. Glycolysis looks exactly the same, but then with alcohol fermentation, we're stripping off a CO2. We've got this acetaldehyde, pulling in some hydrogen ions, electrons, and we're forming ethanol, okay, that alcohol. With our lactate fermentation, this is our alcohol fermentation used to produce beer, bread, these types of things. Now with our lactate fermentation, we take our pyruvate, we strip off these CO2s, use these NADHs, so it's a very similar process, but we're producing lactate in the end here, which can form lactic acid, which makes your muscles sore. Okay. We'll pick up in these last few slides in the next video here about getting energy for these processes, not using glucose.